Welcome to week 8 and our final week of regathering. Our study in Philippians is about to come to a conclusion, and this is the final video in support of our last in-person meeting on Tuesday, August 25th. We'll be meeting out on the front lawn at church at All Souls. And I'm really excited about this concluding lesson in Philippians. There's so much to talk about, so much to think about, that it seems fitting to title this last episode, Think About These Things. It seems to be Paul's mode in his writing is he's deeply theological, but equally practical. Sometimes scholarship has tended to emphasize a structure of Paul being theological early in his letters and practical at the end. And there are some letters that lend themselves to this kind of pattern. Our study through Philippians, though, I think shows us something a little different. His theology is always practical in nature. There's always this sense in which the way we think, the way we respond to God's revelation to us is immensely practical in terms of our daily living. And the practical concerns of the local churches that Paul is dealing with, he's constantly responding to those theologically. And I think this patterning, think about these things, that as we respond to our own church's issues and problems and conundrums, that we should have that impulse like Paul to just think theologically about how God's revealed word to us meets us in these very particular practical moments. And that whenever we're doing our theologizing, it's never fully abstracted from the reality of our daily lives, of our corporate lives as all souls. And so as we start to land the plane with this particular study, I want to raise just a few ideas that come from our text in Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 8. The notion of that which is true, good, and beautiful has been very much a prominent idea in my own thinking as an educator, as somebody who's very much involved in the modern classical Christian education movement, but these aren't solely the domain of a particular movement or educational philosophy. They seem to be part of our thinking about the nature of reality. The way Paul expresses it is he says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, any arete, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. It's this idea that we immerse ourselves in those finest, truest, most excellent things that are the artifacts of God's goodness placed in us. The fact that we are image bearers means that our creative enterprise, those things that we do that add quality and value in the world, are worthy of us incorporating into our beings. And this seems odd because that means that we're engaging in things that go outside of the church, that are beyond what we might find in a Christian bookstore, or are interacting with things that we might consider pagan or non-Christian. It forces us to divide that sacred, secular divide, to cross that divide in such a way that we're appropriating as our own, as things that we can soak our minds in, those things where we see the spark of divinity in the world around us, in the artifacts, in the creations of the world around us, whether it be nature or good literature, beautiful artwork, the creations of our culture, fields of academic endeavor, whether it be astronomy or psychology or chemistry. None of these domains is outside of the knowledge of God, that all truth is God's truth. And therefore, all of these things that we can soak ourselves in are edifying as long as they're critically appropriated in light of our knowledge of God and the work of Christ. That doesn't mean that we can carte blanche just immerse ourselves in, say, secular culture without some of that culture rubbing off on us in ways that might lead us away from our greater conformity into the image of Christ. But to the extent that we, with our biblical worldview, are able to appropriate that, we become better informed about the truths that God has set out into the general world. We also become more winsome in our witness to the world, because we're not just cloistered away in our own domain, not conversant with the world around us, and in some ways judgmental of the artifacts of the world around us. These are profound ideas and ones that are worthy of consideration. And yet, above and beyond all of those, Paul goes on to say, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, in Paul himself. He's saying there's something that shines through of the gospel, that of all of the things that we could fix our minds on, the most true, the most good, the most beautiful is the gospel. So these are some thoughts I want to leave with you. There's this other idea, which is equally profound, very performative, very much that practical outworking of Paul's theology. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I've attached to this idea Rembrandt's painting of Paul. And he looks aged, he looks weak, he looks like he's spent time in effort and toil and is just haggard and worn. When I first looked at this picture in preparation for this study, I just saw reflected in this Rembrandt a picture of the way I feel at the end of this summer, prepping for school, prepping for a return to church, all of the different demands that COVID has placed upon us. And it's ever changing, and you never feel sure that you're coming up with the right policy. So this is, I think, the way many people are feeling right now. It's just haggard and worn. And Paul describes his own experience where he has been brought low. And so he says, I've learned how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And that's when he drops this line, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. It's this notion that we can't use as a faithful guide the feelings we have or some of the material things that are around us. If we're living in abundance, that's not the surest sign that we are abiding in God's will, nor does living in need point to us being outside of God's will. Instead, we have this notion that there is never a point at which we are not completely dependent on God's strength. And the situations and circumstances we find ourselves in, whether it be abundance or need, health or sickness, having opportunity or doors closed in our face, none of those things is taking from us that dependence we would have on the strength that God provides. Equally, whether we're in need or sickness or weakness of any kind, we can rely on God's strength to be able to work through us so that all things are possible. There is a super abundance of ability we have based on the strength that God provides. And this is Paul's reflection as he's been jailed and sends this letter to the Philippians. It's a statement of confidence that despite his chains, God can work through him. And despite the situation that Philippi finds itself in a position of neediness, in a position of some internal conflict, that is the moment where you most recognize your need to abide in the strength that God provides. And then finally, Paul concludes by talking about gifts. And I feel like it's always an appropriate topic to consider the way gifts and church support in the ancient world and in Paul's time and in his thinking might lend itself to our own thinking about what it means to support our churches. In the ancient world, one of the tasks that Paul's missionary endeavor was aimed at was to go to various churches to raise awareness of the needs in the church in Jerusalem, which was hit by famine and persecution. And so his appeal to those churches was to send relief packages, relief gifts, so that the ministry at the Church of Jerusalem could be maintained because the local church members were not in a position to support the ministry to the extent that they had previously. And now we have this notion that Paul received gifts for his ministry from the church in Philippi, and that there's this network of churches, the church in Thessalonica, the church in Philippi, the church in Corinth, Ephesus. They're all networked to one another, and Paul's expectation is that they would meet each other's needs monetarily. And not only that, but ministers would move from one place to another, whether that's Timothy or Epaphroditus or Paul or a host of other people, that they would be crossing these seas and taking those Roman roads to go from one church to another in order to augment the local ministries that were going on there. This background is obviously somewhat different to our own church context, what we've grown up in terms of living in a local church and that local church supporting the ministry of their local minister, who's usually there for a good spell of time, whether it be a decade or two, that they support them and their family so that they may have that singular focus on ministering the gospel in that congregation. It's very rare, although we are a church that seeks to go beyond our walls to support others, whether it's the school in Dandora or the fact that we are networked in the Anglican Communion with other churches in the area where we're praying for other ministers and other congregations in our diocese. This church support idea obviously has its implications for how we give, and that we ought to give and give from our abundance and even give sacrificially for the furtherance of the gospel directly through the professional ministers that are in our midst, and also as they kind of direct ministries within the church to support those programs that kind of emanate from the brainchild of our professional ministers. So this may be a moment where, as you are responding to Paul, you may want to consider, well, what does that mean for me practically? Are there ways in which I need to think about my giving, think about my church support. It could be financial. It could be embodying that gift in some way. Are there ways that I need to get involved at church? Are there ways that I need to connect in this church in some way? There are always needs, and not being on staff at the church, I'm not always aware of what those needs are, but I do know this, that if you were to ask, I'm sure the staff at church would be happy to provide you the opportunities to consider ways that you could give or support in various ways. All right, as we conclude, let's consider running the race set before us. In the words of Paul, what does it take to run a race? I myself have run a few different marathons, and I thought I'd project a few ideas that may be helpful for us as we enter into the school year, as we start to do church in person. The first idea is endurance. It takes endurance. It takes that kind of long view that I'm in this for the long haul. Church life is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And when you make that kind of commitment to be in it for the long haul, there's an abundance of blessing and benefit that I think comes to people who decide, yes, this is my church home. This is a place I can contribute to. This is a place where I can get to know the people around me, to be vulnerable, to trust the people around me so that we can grow together as iron sharpens iron. The second idea is that there are always challenges. I remember running the Chicago Marathon, and there's a hill in mile 22, 23, 24. It is a major obstacle to overcome. Your body is tired, you're exhausted, you haven't drunk enough on the course, and you hit that hill, and they call it the wall. And so you have to break through that wall in order to finish the race. Churches encounter obstacles as well, and individuals do in their walk with Christ. And so running the race set before us, it not only takes endurance, but the will to overcome the challenges that face us. And to be realistic about those challenges. Sometimes you are caught up short. You have to stop and you have to walk. You wanted to run, but this is a moment to walk. And so whatever it takes to overcome those challenges, oftentimes the best way forward is to look squarely at that challenge and go in that direction. More often than not, turning away from the challenge, getting away from the challenge is not going to help you grow. It's not going to help you be the kind of person that is going to be more conformed to the image of Christ. And the third idea is to use your course support. If you ever do a marathon, you've got to plan out, well, when am I going to stop to get water, to walk a few paces, to reset my rhythm, to have a banana to get that potassium into the system. And usually marathons, 5Ks, whatever it is, they have course support. Our church has plenty of course support for you as you run the race before you. There is prayer, and there are ministers that are available to pray with you. In the church bulletin, they're often giving us times when we can come to church and pray with the ministers there. There's obviously our Sunday morning services. There are the house groups. There's catechesis. There are many opportunities we have to live in community, to use that course support so that we can run effectively the race set before us and to grow in greater unity as a bunch of marathoners. So, as Paul says, let's run that race that's set before us. Well, what comes next? We're ending this series, this program, the regathering over the summer. It's not always clear what's next. We have a lot of contingencies. The COVID numbers and models keep spiking and changing, and we're desperately hoping for a vaccine. And so it's not always clear what comes next. As we gather together for Sunday mornings, that's probably our surest hope right now, is to be able to mask and use our phones and gather together as we can. But I would say what really comes next is commitment. Commitment from all of us to be directed towards getting back together as a church, of having that sense of unity, of purpose as all souls. There's prayer, to constantly go to prayer about our church, about the needs of our church, the difficulties and challenges we face. There's communion, both in the sense of us participating together in that Eucharistic meal where we receive the blessing of Christ amongst us, but also the communion of being with one another as the body of Christ, ministering to one another. That's technically what comes next. And then keep watching the website, keep listening to our Sunday morning programming as we discuss when we'll be able to do catechesis again, when the next studies are coming out, and all of that. Well, I personally wanted to thank you all. I don't know how many people have watched these videos and participated that way. There have been a number of people who've come to our in-person meetings on every other Tuesday. It's been a time of growth for me. I know it's been a time of it's felt like an eternal springtime. We went on this COVID break during our spring break, and it feels like now that we're getting back to school, like spring break never ended. But hopefully we are, even though it's turning towards autumn, we're entering into a springtime in our church, a reawakening, a rebirth, a resurrection, as we get back together and renew the in-person relationships that we have. So thank you for following along. Our last in-person meeting will be next Tuesday, August 25th at 7 o'clock. I'd love to see you there. If you can't make it, that's fine. I've enjoyed going along on this journey with you all the same. Thank you, and bye-bye.